Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the Tin Hi-Fi P1 Max. Now, this is a 14.2mm planar magnetic in-ear monitor sent out by Linsol. This is in the same family as the much more talked about Timeless and Raptgo Hook X. After seeing the graphs of the various in-ears with using this planar magnetic driver, I was sort of confused as to why this one seems to be the least hyped, because this one seems like the most neutral balance out of them just based on the measurements. And upon hearing it, that to me seems to be the case. Now, when you receive these, you get them in a white cardboard box that says Tin Hi-Fi P1 Max, giant panda, and you take them out. They're sort of presented on a black cardboard background, and you have a small compartment with the accessories. They don't come with much. They come with tips, which are quite good. You don't really need any aftermarket tips, if you ask me. I haven't been using any. You get no real carry case. You just get a sort of cloth bag like you get with the BLON BLO3 and BLO1. And you get the cable, which is it's a little bit janky. It doesn't really straighten properly, but it is very soft and pliable, so it's very ergonomic. It's perfectly good to use. It just looks a bit wonky in pictures. The connectors and so on there are a sort of chrome-plated and carbon fiber deal that you find on quite a few cables lately. But quite nice overall, has a little bit of a strain relief. Now, the in-ear monitor itself is a black acrylic with some metal flake in it that makes it shine in the sunlight, and it also has a sort of fish scale pattern on it almost, an insert on it. That makes it look pretty understated, but quite nice. There's no actual branding on there other than just left and right, and that's it. You have a few ports on the inside, and the main nozzle itself, which has a good length. The overall build of the shell itself seems very good, and it is very, very comfortable. It's very light and ergonomic feeling because of the acrylic, compared to the in-the-hand more premium feeling ones that are made out of like CNC'd aluminium, which then in the ear can be a little less comfortable because of the weight and because of more sharp angles, but it's not a big difference. Though I'd say these are probably the most comfortable out of all of them currently. Now, the what we're here for is the sound. The sound of these is very, very good, I think, especially for the price they're currently at. They are currently, it looks like, competing with the Dioko for almost the $100 mark. I think at that, these are very, very solid alternative to the Dioko, and to me in many ways preferred. Now, the bass itself has mid-bass, but not a pronounced one. It just has a bit there. It's less than what you find on the Timeless, and quite a bit less than you find on the Raptgo Hook X, but it's enough so that it gives notes a good sort of weight, and it gives electronic music good punch and drive. And stuff like metal that can sort of lack in the actual sort of fullness and bass area of the music gets just that little bit it needs to actually function and be enjoyable to listen to, which something like the Dioko, for example, doesn't give it because of its very, very clean tuning in the bottom end that exclusively has sub-bass and no actual mid-bass. Now, the downside of having mid-bass is to some it might sound very slightly bloated, but it's going to be significantly less than you find with a lot of other offerings, such as both the other Planars and a lot of dynamics like the BLON models. The bass is very well controlled, very detailed, as you'd expect from a planar. Not quite to the level of an Audeze LCD-i3, but that's not really a fair comparison, though this has the benefit of not needing EQ whatsoever, and the bass having actual punch, which the Audeze doesn't. Now, moving on to the mid-range, that has a sort of gradual slant upwards, up to about 2K, where it starts falling off again. Now, that slant is slightly more gradual than you find in the Harman curve, and to me, it seems to lead to a more natural, more sort of filled out vocal range for singers, and also for a lot of the more natural instruments in music. They get less unnaturally accentuated, but get some more natural sort of depth and body to them from this. That's also helped by the fact it doesn't have pinner gain to quite the degree that Harman would suggest. It sort of cuts off and rolls off gradually, as you see on quite a lot of in-ear monitors lately, so I think people have figured out that works well, which I agree with. The only real characteristic that you find when you go further up, other than that slant downwards, is a resonance peak at around 8 kilohertz for me and on measurement rigs, though some people reported it being all the way down to 6 kilohertz in their ear canals. To me, that simply adds a bit of sparkle to the upper notes, that sort of accentuates details on things such as like string instruments, percussion, and brass instruments. But it's not enough that it becomes unpleasant or sibilant in any way. It sounds overall very, very neutral. It just has a sort of upper shimmer to it in a way that you can tell on some music. Particularly if you have like very overproduced modern music, it gets sort of a little bit of a shimmer up there. But well-recorded, particularly natural music, you don't get any of that. It's just an added layer of sort of a sense of detail in a way. The soundstage is very, very good. It's not a giant one, but it's not in your head either. It's sort of right around the vicinity of your head, as you will find in anything that's sort of quite neutrally tuned, I think. Where it's very good is its image placement and precision. It's very good at both the left to right placement and also depth, as you'll see in some of the musical examples I'll give in a moment. Detail retrieval overall is very good, particularly for this price range. It's, as mentioned before, not quite on the level of the Audeze, I don't think. But the Audeze is quite oddly tuned and needs EQ, which means it's not really a reasonable comparison to me. Aside from that, it's a sort of case where you definitely don't feel like you're missing any details. It sounds very detailed. I just know that some things that are tuned brighter or differently can accentuate details in a more obvious manner. This doesn't really get in your face about it, which I think is sort of part of the reason why it hasn't been grabbing so much attention. Now, I'll just put these off to the side and grab my notes, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of different music genres and pieces, how these actually perform with that kind of music in practice. First off is Dawn of Nashira by Dirtwire. It's a sort of minimalist, primordial sort of wind instrument piece, where this, in contrast to, for example, the Dioko, lays a very good foundation of a sort of bassy drone from these instruments, whilst also at the same time having the space and detail to really let the more upper frequency, light, reedy wind instruments more sort of clear and stand out. But it just builds an ambience and foundation by having that mid bass, just enough of it that it's never overstated. It's just enough that it's actually there and you can feel the actual presence of the notes. Big Yellow Taxi by Cherney Sutton. That's a female vocal focused jazz track with just her vocals and some drums. It really highlights how good this is at voices in some ways. It's not one that's like a Norah Jones, where it's like very obvious that the female voice sounds very good. This is a more difficult one to tackle because her voice isn't so filled out, and this helps make sure it doesn't get too thin either, because if you have anything that's missing any information there, this can suddenly start sounding a bit thin, and it doesn't here. It just is a very well textured, has a bit of a body to it, and you get all the little bits up top that you want in there to have her voice to really be clear and textured. The drum kit in the background is very clear around you. It's sort of placed behind her and off to the sides. It seems like it's marked in the center. Brushwork is very, very well defined. The only things are like the hi-hats, when he steps on them particularly hard, can get a bit on edge, but not so much that it's at all an issue. Moving on to Danse Macabre by Leopold Stokowski. That's a classical track. It's not a massively dynamic track, so the actual presentation in that sense is somewhat flat. It just has its sort of ebbs and flows. It's not a very aggressive track in that sense. But what this does really well with that track specifically is the placement, where you can hear each individual instrument. You can hear like one sitting right there when it's an individual one, or like, off to the sides. But then when you have the larger groups of the orchestra, sometimes you'll hear like the string section is farther back in the music hall and sort of more diffuse because it's getting more of the actual room reverb. So you can very clearly tell both depth and placement to sides. Going on to The Maker, Like Machines, it's a heavy metal track, a very sort of rough and gritty one. It's one of those that's not like overly well produced and overly well recorded, as is common of these genres. And you can tell that very clearly. that 8K peak here can like make that noise and grit become slightly like noticeable, which it is in this track, to be very clear. That's not something this is doing specifically. It's just like you will notice that, so you can't really blow the volume too hard. But that being said, it has enough of a bass foundation that the track still get good drive and can actually, like, the metal is very enjoyable. I think these are actually some of my favorite in-ears for metal, because they have such an even response and good technicalities that they can actually separate both the actual noise in like the guitars. You can hear the grains of that noise clearly, but without it making everything else grainy. Like his voice at the same time sounds natural. It doesn't have the grain that I found long ago, for example, listening to the original Audeze LCD-i3 that made everything sort of sound a bit grainy. This makes it grainy where the music is, but everything else sounds more organic and natural. And the guitar and so on gets, again, good note weight, good texture, and his voice is clear out of that whole mix. Then lastly, I have a Drown by Szabo, which is a sort of hard-hitting industrial techno track, where the bass is a sort of very sort of pressure wave in your head sound that's just like a constant build, which, for example, the LCD-i3 can't do at all. That has none of the actual, it doesn't create that sense of pressure, which this can do because of the way that mid bass is tuned. It doesn't become overbearing because it's not overblown, but it's just enough there that you get that sense. But at the same time, it's well enough tuned that you can still tell all the individual percussion pieces going off around you in that track, like separate those out. Now, that being said, an interesting thing with this one is because electronic music often, I guess the percussion might literally be a digitized thing, or it's just like very severely produced. They get so almost V-shaped sounding, like the treble is so much that somewhat limits your volume dial on some electronic music, where like it's particularly, I find hi-hats in specifically electronic music are very, very tizzy in general, and here it can seem to interact with that resonance peak for me. That said, again, I think these are very good for electronic music because they are so controlled and detailed, so they give you good slam. They just won't give you the same sort of like a BLON will give you like a big heavy hit with no, like, it's a bit more organic feeling. It's not quite as aggressive because it's not quite as controlled, whereas this is like, you can sense there is the control, but there is still enough mid bass to be fun at the same time, but not so much that it becomes bloated. So overall, I think these are actually excellent at pretty much every genre. There's no real standout character to them that sort of would make me go, like, brighter, more lean tune sets are often very good at acoustic music, but then when you go into metal and electronic, it gets a bit boring. But at the same time round, when you get stuff that is like some blondes that can be a bit bassy, or blondes ain't not even that bad in that regard, but more bassy than you get, it works well with, well, electronic and metal if you're not too bothered about the lack of potential detail. But then it gets a bit, again, it loses the exciting sparkle when you go into jazz, where these are very good at both things. The only overall standout characters here that I could see making some people steer away from these would be either if you absolutely don't like mid-bass at all. These do have some. It's not much, so I'd say give them a try, but they do have some, so that might be a reason to not want them. And they have that upper sparkle. They do have a sort of slight sense that is a bit of a shimmer to things. If you're very allergic to that, I guess steer clear of it. There are some sets that are better at cancelling out that region, but beware that your resonance frequency will be different from what the measurement rigs have, potentially anyway. You can check that yourself. But yeah, so overall, I think these are a very, very good buy, and one that I definitely recommend considering, particularly currently where they're priced somewhat similarly to the Dioko, as an alternative if you want something that has a more slightly fuller, slightly more organic sound. It's not that's doing a bit of a disservice, it's just that the Dioko by comparison isn't that bright. It's not like the Raptgo Hook X, which is very warm. This is just an all-round very good piece, I think. So yeah, I definitely recommend these. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in comments. I'll link the music that I've used down below if I can find it on YouTube. And tell me what you think about these. Why do you think these have sort of dropped off the planet in some ways and gotten not quite as much hype as some of the other models using the same driver? Other than that, enjoy the music, and I'll see you in the next video. Have fun.